Will Georgia's playstyle be what ends the Dogs in 2025? I don't know. In fact, I'm not sure it does, and I think each game is independent of one another. But when you think about it, and when you roll through the season and look at Georgia's schedule, what has happened with Florida? What has happened with Tennessee? What has happened with Bama? Not Kentucky, but Auburn. These close SEC football games where Georgia has a plan to grind it out, wear the other team down with the run game. Will that be the death of the Dogs? Will the defensive line be the end for Georgia? It's just a possibility I want to discuss. It's not something that I'm necessarily telling you is going to happen. And when I examine the regular season, I don't think it happens in the regular season. This is a playoff football team. That's what I've watched this season. I've watched the Georgia Bulldogs, to me, get very close to cementing a playoff spot. There is more work to be done before that happens. But I want to talk about with these matchups against Tech, against Mississippi State, Texas coming up. Their three, biggest matchups left. The Charlotte game, you kind of throw one out. Georgia should win that handedly. I just think you have to look at and say, is Georgia going to get tripped up by not being able to separate from these teams? Ryan Curley from Dawg Post discussing the possibilities of what might be the end for Georgia this season. Now, when we look across college football, and tonight the ranking show is coming out, the original college football rankings for this season, I think that Georgia's going to be number 5 like they are in the AP poll, and that's where Georgia belongs at the moment. My question is when it gets to the playoffs, when Georgia has to, face Alabama again or face Texas A&M or Indiana or Ohio State, those teams up towards the top, will Georgia be able to grind it out against those teams? That's the real question, and let's explore that. Explore Sales Hatch 2, barcoding it down below. One of our partners who kind of is the middleman for you in sales, they make it easier, right? They make the connections for you and help you execute business. Make sure you're checking out Sales Hatch. I like to keep these brief, but we do appreciate what they're doing for us. When you examine Georgia's schedule for the rest of the season, at Mississippi State, look, noon game, I think Georgia's going to be fine. We're going to talk more about that as this week goes on. I do think that Mississippi State has fought with a handful of teams and could make this interesting. I do think Georgia will win that. Home against Texas at night, I think it's going to be tough for the Longhorns to come into Athens and win that game, but they certainly have the talent to physically match up with Georgia. I think that is clear, right? Even though they're not playing up to the standard that we thought that they would play at. Georgia Tech on a neutral field in Mercedes-Benz Stadium, I think it's difficult. I think that Haynes King and that Georgia Tech offense is the type of offense that really could give Georgia some trouble. When you just think about mobile quarterback, you think about all that misdirection, you think about what they do with their tight ends and their running backs. I think Georgia could have a hard time with that. I think Georgia's defense is a little bit more of the worry. When you look at what happened against Florida this past week, that's a tough defense. I think that's a really fast defense. That was something that really stuck out to me about the Gators was, man, they fly to the ball. Against Ole Miss, it was Georgia's defense that was the issue, right? It was Georgia was able to kind of score at will against the Rebels. So you look at a game like that and you say, okay, Gunnar Stockton can throw for 4 touchdowns if you need him to. Gunnar Stockton made a lot of really big passes up in Knoxville as well when you look at that game. But you do wonder, what happens if Georgia plays an electric offense like Texas A&M or Indiana again? We've seen them have to gut it out against Tennessee, have to gut it out against Ole Miss, and really against bad offenses and good defenses like Florida and Auburn. They had to gut that out in a different fashion, right, in a lower scoring game. What we're seeing is Georgia's ability to win the game in different ways. And so I don't think you get too concerned about Georgia as long as it does what it needs to do. Against Florida, it didn't really allow big drives. It was an interception. It was bad special teams play that led to Florida having shorter fields and scoring off of that. Now, I think that Georgia's offense lulled for a very long time against the Gators, and I think that it lulled for a very long time against Alabama. It lulled for a very long time against Auburn. those are the things you kind of get concerned with when you say, hey, in the second quarter against Florida, why is Georgia committing to running up the gut so much when it's not working during that period? Florida was out rushing Georgia heading into the fourth quarter of that game by, I think, 6 yards roughly. And then Georgia just grinded out in the fourth quarter. That's when the running game really worked. But it wasn't working, and they didn't get away from it early on. Against Auburn, kind of similar. You see the ability for Georgia to fly down the field against some of these teams. You saw that ability against Ole Miss. It didn't happen in those other games. You saw it against Tennessee. You didn't really see it against Alabama either. I think that once Georgia gets to the playoff, which I think it should, I think it has the ability to lose one more of these next 4 games and still slip in as one of the top 12 teams in college football. An explosive offense with a better defense, which is what those teams have, could give Georgia problems. Texas A&M could give Georgia problems. Now, when I'm talking about this, it sounds almost silly that I'm even asking this question, because what we've seen is each game is independent of one another. And look, this is a top 5 team in college football that's shown that they can be explosive on offense. But you wonder if they play a team that has both, particularly A&M, Indiana, and Ohio State, is that where Georgia's just not going to be able to handle it? And those games would likely be on a neutral field unless things don't shake out over the next few weeks the way that I think they may shake out. I think Indiana, I think Texas A&M has a really good chance, along with Bama and Ohio State. I think all those teams have a chance to win out the regular season the way I think Georgia will. Conference championship weekend, we might see those 4 teams have to deal with each other. Now, if A&M goes on to lose to Texas, gets a little muddier, Georgia will have an opportunity to play in the SEC championship based off the tiebreakers. I think it's going to get close, because if Georgia beats Texas, then I think Georgia would go in. The tiebreaker is not completely clear in that scenario because it comes down to common opponents and what you did. In that case, Georgia would have done better against common opponents when we're talking about Texas. Now, Georgia also has to beat Mississippi State for that to happen. And here's the thing. If it does come down to a tiebreaker, the scores against those opponents do matter too. So what I mean is, if Georgia can't separate on Florida, which, yeah, I get comments like, yeah, Ryan, Georgia could have won 31-20 if it wanted to, right? Because Gunnar Stockton needs the ball at the end there, and it's a double-digit point win, and Georgia covers the spread, and it just looks a little bit cleaner on paper. Yes, I understand that, but in a lot of worlds, a team would run out the clock in that situation and win the score, and the win is what ultimately mattered. You wonder, if you look at the committee, is the committee going to look at the box scores of these games like it seems they have in the past? I don't know the answer to that, but Georgia should have the ability to grind out against Mississippi State. I think it will struggle to do that a little bit more against Texas, who for 3 quarters defended Vanderbilt this past weekend really well. It was that fourth quarter where they explode. You look at that and you say, okay, well, Pavi can do that. I think Gunnar Stockton can do that too. I think the Georgia passing offense can do that too. You see that on certain drives against Tennessee. You see that on a lot of drives against Ole Miss. Can it do that against Texas at home? I think so. Look, I'm going to go ahead and tell you this. Georgia's defense may struggle against Georgia Tech, but I think Georgia's offense could have a field day with that Georgia Tech defense that just allowed over 40 points to NC State, that allowed 28 to a bad Wake Forest team that's struggled a little bit more than people realize against a schedule that's not great, right? I mean, they just allowed 48 points to NC State. Not ideal. A bad Colorado team put up 20 on them, right? So I think that defensively, Georgia Tech is not going to pose a ton of issues for Georgia. They are off this weekend before they have to go to Boston College and then deal with Pittsburgh. I think that Georgia Tech will be a one-loss team heading into that Georgia game. But you get more concerned about what happens in the SEC championship or that second round of the playoffs with Georgia. Why am I looking so far ahead? This is the standard for Georgia. It's to compete for these national championships, and it's going to end up in these big games against these teams. If it cannot be explosive on offense against one of these other elite teams that have explosive offenses themselves, it's going to be a really big problem. The play style, the commitment to the run, I think it could be an issue. But we've seen Gunnar Stockton can throw the ball downfield. He can have a 4-touchdown passing game. He can, make clutch throws like he did up in Knoxville. I just think that there's going to be issues if they play Indiana, Texas A&M, and Ohio State. I'm not saying that they're going to lose to those teams necessarily, but that's where my concern would be is, can this team make it to the end? That's the standard at Georgia. Thanks for watching.